given a really excellent talk on the difficulties of interpreting brain behaviour research in relation to dementia. And then gradually the tone of the talk started to change, and gone were any references to difficulties of interpreting data or alternative ways of interpreting results. And instead, the talk became a series of assertions with no critical evaluation at all. And we realised simultaneously that the speaker had started talking about schizophrenia. And Anne, my colleague, turned to me and shook her head and said rather ruefully, "All critical thought stops here." And we were discussing the talk afterwards, and we reflected that it's certainly the case that the idea of schizophrenia has long had the power to deprive otherwise intelligent people of their critical faculties. And this is also increasingly true of genetics, where people seem able to make almost any claim about the impact of genes on behaviour without being seriously challenged, or often without being challenged at all. And so if we put these two topics together, schizophrenia and genetics, then I don't think we should be at all surprised at the sheer lack of critical thinking in that area. Now, before I look at this phenomenon in a bit more detail, I want to just say a few words about why it might be important. That is, this phenomenon of lack of critical thought. First of all, if claims about schizophrenia and genetics are made and uncritically accepted, then they may have a very large impact on research priorities. So, for example, in 2000, the US National Institute of Mental Health highlighted genetics as the first in a list of research priorities, none of which incidentally included social or psychological factors, and then went on to suggest that perhaps no area has more promise for understanding what goes wrong in the brain in schizophrenia than does genetics. There's another reason why I think this issue is important, is that if we look at the rather sparse literature on prevention in schizophrenia, which probably must be one of the most sparse areas of the whole schizophrenia research, what we find is that the general air of this small literature is almost one of hopelessness. And I think that's quite understandable, because if everyone knows, in inverted commas, that schizophrenia is a genetic disorder, but if those genes have not been identified, then it's very difficult to see what can be done that isn't provisional or second rate while we wait for these genes to be discovered. And I think the perceived importance of genetic research in prevention was highlighted for me by the remarks of one commentator who said that in planning the development and evaluation of early intervention and prevention programs in schizophrenia, the first challenge is to strengthen the identification of risk factors, especially genetic risk factors. Now, the point here is that as long as people believe that this challenge can be met, and that's obviously a belief which is fed by the uncritical presentation and acceptance of genetic research, then prevention by any other means will simply be neglected. And finally, I think we should be very concerned about the ethical implications of this lack of critical thinking. And claims about schizophrenia and genetics have a quite profound influence on people's lives, whether it involves the information people are given about themselves or their relatives, the use of research fund, or indeed the perceived need for genetic counselling. And all of these factors are important as social and psychological consequences of claims about schizophrenia and genetics. And just an aside, that one of my relatives in North America adopted a child a few years ago, and she told me that the children of mothers who'd been diagnosed as schizophrenic, as she put it rather ruefully, it could hardly be given away. No one wanted them. And I think that's something we should be very concerned about, if that's part of the influence of this research area. So what I want to do in this talk is look at three areas of this phenomenon. I want to look at some examples of lack of critical thinking, fairly briefly. Then some of the reasons for it, and then also very briefly, because this afternoon that will be looked at in more detail, some of the remedies. Now, one fairly obvious example of lack of critical thinking in this area is the frequent making of assertions about genetics and schizophrenia which bear no relationship whatsoever to the actual data from research studies. And if we look for a moment at the actual results of twin and adoption studies in schizophrenia, we can see some of this in action. First of all, twin studies. Now, Jay has been talking about these, but specifically on schizophrenia, the MZ concordances range from 78% to 0, the DZ from 27% to 0. Now, just to make mathematical sense of what I'm going to say next and I'll call that 0%, 1%, this means that in at least one of the studies, the DZ concordance rate is 27 times higher than the MZ concordance rate in another study. And it's incredibly difficult to see how you could get a genetic model to explain that. Equally, in another two studies, the DZ rate is twice that of the MZ rate. So what's clear from these studies is a huge amount of inconsistency in the data. Now, if we look at the adoption studies, now these are terribly important because although Jay is absolutely right in talking about the lack of criticism of twin studies, very occasionally, and it is very occasional, a tiny criticism crops up, which is to say that the twins were raised together because of the problems that Jay highlighted. But the reason that criticism is allowed in is because the commentator immediately comes along and says, but we've got these adoption studies which got rid of all that, and so we don't actually need to pay too much attention to the twin studies. So let's just look briefly at some of the results of the adoption studies. There are two sorts of adoption studies. In the first one, the index group are children who were adopted very young, and those children are diagnosed as schizophrenics as adults. You then look back and find their biological relatives and hope to find a very raised rate of schizophrenia diagnoses. The control group here are adopted children with no psychiatric admissions. Well, here are some of the results of those kind of studies. First of all, no significant difference in the prevalence of schizophrenia spectrum diagnoses in the first-degree biological relatives of index and control, which, by any standards, doesn't support a genetic hypothesis. Second finding, the incidence of schizophrenia spectrum diagnosis in the first-degree biological relatives of this schizophrenic index group is no higher than the general population. In fact, interestingly, the incidence of schizophrenia spectrum diagnosis was double in the control group biological relatives, although the difference wasn't statistically significant because we're dealing with small samples. And finally, no significant difference in the number of biological families of index and control groups with one or more diagnoses of schizophrenia spectrum. You're really scraping the bottom of the barrel with this final comparison, but still no significant results. And then there's a second type of adoption study where the index group are adopted children who have a biological parent diagnosed as schizophrenia or schizophrenia spectrum. And the control group are adopted children whose biological parents have no known psychiatric admissions. So what you're looking for, obviously, is a high rate of pathology, if you want to call it that, in this index group, because their biological relatives had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And here's some of the results of those studies. No significant difference in prevalence of schizophrenia or spectrum diagnoses in index and control groups. No significant difference between index and control groups on any pathology scale of the MMPI. I could have expanded that second line considerably as the researchers became increasingly desperate in their search for differences and found none, but that's the one I've put up there. And finally, the strongest predictors of adoptees' psychiatric status is the adoptive family functioning and the adoptive mother's mental health. So I think it's fair to say that these results don't look very hopeful for genetic hypotheses, but I'm going to quote what various commentators have said about this research. They've said that the evidence that genetic factors play a major role in the etiology of schizophrenia is already beyond challenge. and that an impressive body of evidence suggests that inheritance plays an important part in schizophrenia, that twin and adoption studies show that there is a substantial genetic influence in schizophrenia, and that data from twin, family and adoption studies show overwhelming evidence of a substantial genetic component in schizophrenia. Now, I think it's quite difficult to see how you get from these results to those comments without at least some muting of your critical faculties. And I'll return later to some of the ways in which that's achieved. But I just want to provide briefly another example of the lack of critical thinking, and that's in the presentation of research in secondary sources. I think it's fair to say that psychology has always prided itself on its ability to evaluate research, to discuss methodological and statistical issues, and also the problems of interpreting research data. And in fact, these are usually claimed to be integral part of an education in psychology. Yet in the psychology textbooks I've looked at, which are mainly aimed at psychology students, there was virtually none of this in the presentation of research on schizophrenia and genetics. It's a bit like the neuroscientists' talk. And I think this is rather extraordinary because it not only violates the conventions of psychology writing, but as you probably know, in the last 15 years or so, at least half a dozen very detailed conceptual, methodological and statistical critiques of genetic research have been published. But the authors of these student textbooks have decided not to mention any of this, and I know for a fact that at least 2 of them know exactly about the existence of these studies, but they've decided not to mention any of them. It's very unlikely that the other authors are unaware of the criticisms because they've been published in very accessible places, but they've simply not been mentioned at all. And I think that's a phenomenon which should give us pause, that there is not a single mention that these studies even exist. Now, why then might there be so little critical thinking in this area? Well, it might be useful, I think, to make an admittedly crude distinction, it is very crude, between motivated and unmotivated lack of critical thought. And by unmotivated, I mean people who have no obvious vested interest in maintaining the idea of a genetic disorder called schizophrenia, and yet do believe that such exists. And I'd include in this group the general public, the media, students, and many academics. And I think that one very obvious reason for the lack of critical thinking in these groups is that the results that I've shown here and on the other slide are not usually reported. They're not usually reported in secondary sources. In fact, in the adoption studies, they're not even reported in the primary sources. In order to get these results, well, some of that, 1 or 2 of them are, but they're then glossed over. But in fact, most of them are not reported. And I've had to get them by analysing the data myself. And what we have instead are selective reporting of results, often from inappropriate statistical analysis. We have variables and samples which suddenly change definition when it looks as if the results are not going in favour of a genetic hypothesis. And for example, one of the textbooks I looked at reported that the concordance rate for schizophrenia in MZ twins was 48.3%. Now, no twin study has reported this concordance rate, and there was no indication at all of how that figure had been arrived at. There's no reference given for it or anything. And some important facts that are omitted from the reporting of adoption studies include the secondary reporting, include the fact that significant results have depended on the meaningless combination of first and second degree relatives, the fact that interviews with some dead relatives have actually been invented by the researchers, and the fact that one result claimed to support the genetic hypothesis was actually the result of an arithmetic error. And this result continued to be reported years after the error had been privately admitted to an inquirer. Now, I think this lack of presentation of with some exceptions, I don't want to say that none of these results have been presented, but a good many of them haven't. But this lack of presentation of the actual results and the lack of critical evaluation of those data which are actually reported means that, as well as being seriously misinformed, very large numbers of people are directly taught not to think critically. And instead, they're presented with supposed facts which don't seem to require any critical reflection. But in any case, they're not given the means for critical thinking, so that it's quite unlikely they would even know what questions to ask. And I think we can add to this the difficulties for ordinary people or non-specialists in assuming that prestigious researchers are actually misrepresenting their research. And I think this is one of the most difficult things for us to get our head around, the sheer extent of misrepresentation, dishonesty, and almost outright fraud in this research area. You'd have to be very sure of your grounds to make those sorts of claims. And that confidence, of course, is precisely the outcome which is least likely from the kind of reporting I've been talking about. I think another factor which could help explain this lack of critical thinking is what seems to me to be a double standard in judgments made about different areas of research. And we seem to be much more lax in our judgments of research on people than we are in judgments of research on the physical, chemical or biological world. And in relation to this, it's very interesting to note what happened when genetic research in schizophrenia actually became genetic with the study of genetic markers, not quite genes, but genetic markers, as distinct from the study of family behaviour, which characterised the twin and adoption studies. And what happened is that in these papers, these primary papers, the researchers' conclusions began to be closely related to their actual research data, which I have to tell you is a very new phenomenon in this area. And we even saw for the first time papers whose very titles reflected the lack of evidence for the genetic hypotheses. For example, I'll just give you a couple of them. One paper is entitled Lack of Linkage of Chromosome 5q11 to q13 Markers in 6 Schizophrenia Pedigrees. And another is entitled Dopamine Receptor D4 Gene is not associated with major psychosis. So that's very open reporting of a lack of evidence. And there are actually many such papers, and I think that one of the reasons for this unusual openness in reporting is that for the first time, entirely independent scientists, geneticists, molecular biologists and so on, were involved in this area of schizophrenia research. And they simply weren't accustomed to or had no reason to misrepresent their research results. Now, I don't want to get into the fact that biological science is good and psychological is bad, but I do think there is a considerable difference in the way, in the relationship between data and conclusions in the two areas. I think it's also much less easy to misinterpret this kind of research. And researchers' claims can be checked out by new research much more quickly than in the twin and adoption studies. And I'll return to this issue later. But for the moment, I want to look at motivated lack of critical thinking. And I'm including here those people or groups who seem to have some kind of interest in maintaining the idea of a genetic disorder called schizophrenia. One advantage, of course, is that it removes, or seems to remove, responsibility for behaviour which might be judged very negatively by other people. For example, parents and families have been told that the genetic evidence exonerates them from having caused their child schizophrenia, or that it relieves them of the burden of guilt that their illness is a consequence of bad parenting. And so important is this issue of blame and responsibility that it now drives the whole research agenda on studies of family interaction, with researchers at pains to reassure us that families can influence their relatives' behaviour, but only after a diagnosis of schizophrenia has been given and not before. Now, of course, there's no evidence for this very strange claim. And given the known continuity between psychotic and other so-called normal experiences, it does seem to me rather like claiming that parents can influence their children's antisocial behaviour only after they've been convicted of a criminal offence, or influence their educational achievement, but only after they've got their A-levels. Now, another group with a clear interest in the uncritical acceptance of genetic research is psychiatry itself, although increasingly I feel that US clinical psychology has to be added to those groups. And many commentators have pointed to the huge importance of the idea of schizophrenia to the credibility of psychiatry's claim to be part of the medical profession. Now, this claim, of course, is based on the idea of schizophrenia as a brain disease. But we know that over 100 years of biochemical and imaging research has failed to discover the nature of this brain abnormality. Now, of course, this research can be talked up, misleading claims can be made about it, but I think researchers actually have to be quite careful about what they claim about this research, because if in fact a clear difference between the brains of diagnosed schizophrenics and the rest of us were to be reliably identified, then this feature would have to be incorporated into the diagnostic criteria. In exactly the same way, for example, as the old diagnostic criteria for Down syndrome changed when it was discovered that they were associated with chromosome abnormalities. So in the absence of such changes in the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, then researchers, if pushed, and it usually is only if they're pushed, have to admit that the results of biological and brain research in schizophrenia have so far been pretty negative. Now, this raises the question of why the research isn't abandoned, or at the very least downgraded, while researchers pursue more promising avenues. And one very major reason is that biological research is very heavily protected by the claims made for genetic research. Not, I want to emphasise, by claims made about genetic linkage studies, which actually provide little protection because, as I said earlier, their failure to produce reliable data has been clearly admitted and is highly visible. But instead, the protection comes from twin and adoption studies whose failures have been elaborately concealed. And it's very notable that when professionals who want to shore up genetic hypotheses are speaking to the media or speaking in the literature, they often don't even mention genetic linkage studies, but usually fall back on twin and adoption studies. And actually, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that twin and adoption studies form the crucial last line of defence. I'm actually going to contradict myself later in that, but for the moment, form the crucial last line of defence for the concept of schizophrenia. And that these studies bear a very heavy burden of supporting and making credible the biological concept of schizophrenia in the absence of any direct supporting evidence. And I think that it's really not surprising then that their deficiencies and as well as their actual results have to be so carefully obscured. Now, I want briefly to look at another factor which I think is likely to be involved in this uncritical acceptance of genetic research, but applies equally to the motivated and unmotivated groups I've been talking about, and I think also places this phenomenon in a wider cultural context. And I'm referring here to the idea of genetic possession, which has recently been put forward by the psychologist Graham Richards. And as you know, possession refers in its most general sense to the notion that some kind of autonomous and separate agency has taken psychological control of a person. And it could involve possession by ancestors, deities, demons, or animal spirits. Now, of course, we in the West have tended to distance ourselves from these ideas, and ironically, psychiatry has played a primary role in this distancing. For example, in challenging the ideas of epilepsy as divine possession or hysteria as demonic possession. And indeed, one way historically of promoting schizophrenia as a disease has been to emphasise that it is not a possession phenomenon. So, for example, a New Scientist editorial some years ago claimed that schizophrenia is not mystical. I mean, whoever said it was? It has physical causes. Or it was also claimed that schizophrenia is not caused by devils. It is a physical disease. Now, as Richards points out, although people seem to want to distance themselves from these possession ideas, possession-like phenomena are actually alive and well in Western cultures. For example, when we talk about entering into the spirit of things, or about multiple personality, or even when men or women who seek sex change surgery talk about an opposite sex person being trapped in their body. But what Graham Richards is suggesting is that possession has for some time been on the point of assuming a new cultural form, that of genetic possession. And that not since the 19th century heyday of eugenics has it become so routine to ascribe so much human psychology to genes. And as he goes on to point out, the scarcely articulated premise of all this is that if something is genetic, it's beyond our control, or at least not part of our personal psychological identity or our responsible self. So when behaviour attributed to a gene becomes especially problematic or salient, then one psychological option open to us is to treat the gene as an alien or autonomous or possessing agency, so that the individual in whom this gene resides might see themselves, or certainly be seen by others, as the helpless embodiment or agent of the gene. Now, what's interesting is that the traditional language which surrounds schizophrenia is already in this form. Schizophrenia is said to develop, it's said to progress, it's said to remit. In other words, it's something that happens to people, something to which they're mere onlookers. And it seems that they have no active role in this development, except, of course, to take prescribed medication. And the point here is that the way we talk about psychotic behaviour and what we believe about it fits perfectly into an ancient and persistent cultural framework, that of possession, which is currently being very, very strongly reactivated. And I think that this all very much favours a continued uncritical acceptance of genetic theories and research. Now that is some, but only a few, of the reasons for the uncritical acceptance of genetic research. But what about remedies? Well, as I say, that's part of this afternoon's discussion, but I'd like to mention one remedy which I think has to be in place before much else can be achieved, and that is a complete reconceptualisation of psychotic behaviour and experience. Now, I'm sure many of you know that the concept of schizophrenia has been subjected to intense criticism on the grounds of lack of scientific validity. And it's been suggested that researchers should focus instead on psychotic experiences in their own right, such as hearing voices or expressing unusual beliefs or talking incoherently. And a great deal of research has already been done using those ideas. Now, I see two aspects of this research as absolutely crucial in potentially raising people's consciousness about the problems of genetic research. The first is that the research emphasises the continuity between psychotic and so-called normal behaviour and experience. And the second is that at least some of this research, not all of it, but certainly some of it, emphasises the purposeful nature of psychosis. That is, that it has meaning in the context of people's lives and serves important functions for them. And this often means paying very close attention to the content of psychotic experiences, i.e. what voices say or what a person believes. And this is an aspect which has been seriously neglected in traditional research. Now, I want to just digress for a moment in explaining why these aspects, that is continuity, meaning and function, are so important in laying the groundwork for challenges to genetic research. I think that one of the reasons people are so credulous in the face of genetic theories of psychosis, regardless of the evidence in favour of them, even when they know the evidence, is because of the widespread public acceptance of the existence of a brain disease called schizophrenia. And it seems very reasonable that genes might be implicated in such a brain disease. But, as I said earlier, biological research in schizophrenia is actually very weak. And it depends for its continued credibility on false beliefs about the success of genetic research. But if we take one step back from that, I think that it might actually be more accurate to say that the credibility of both genetic and biological research in schizophrenia depends on the claim that schizophrenic behaviour is not understandable in ordinary cultural terms. And I may be making a too outlandish claim, but I think that may be the key to a great deal of the credulity. And insofar as psychological and social research question this claim, and insofar as research suggests that psychotic behaviour and experiences have meaning and purpose in people's lives, then they inevitably raise questions about the credibility of genetic or credibility of genes as an adequate explanation. Only raise questions, I'm not sure how strong a challenge they would provide. Now, what's interesting, of course, is to look at the response to this new psychological and social research by those who want to retain genetic theories. And one of the things that has been done in order to retain genetic theories is to posit the increasingly popular and tautological idea of vulnerability. And I think that part of its popularity is the role it plays in protecting genetic theories. So I think that if we are going to become more or less credulous, or help others to be less credulous, we need a multi-pronged approach to remedying the situation. That it would involve challenging traditional conceptualizations of psychosis, and as well as attempts made to protect them, for example, through vulnerability. We need an approach which communicates the serious flaws in genetic research and the true state of the evidence base. But I think we also need an approach which highlights the social and cultural context which provides such a fertile ground for the uncritical acceptance of genetic research in schizophrenia, regardless of its quality.
Thank you very much.